Well, let's go ahead and kick this off. Yael, thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is evening for you, which means not only are you giving up your time, you're giving up your evening, which is a big deal in my world.
Very happy to do it. Really
Oh,
delighted and honored to be invited.
wonderful. Well, I just want to welcome everyone to our live book event hosted by the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and the Williams Collection of Lincolniana. I'm Susanna Url, the Williams Chair for the Study of Abraham Lincoln and the American Civil War, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Ann Marshall, who's Associate Professor of History and the Executive Director of the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. We're both joining you from Mississippi State University, where it is our pleasure to bring you today, that's good, to host our special guest, Dr. Yael Sternhell, who received her PhD from Princeton University in 2008, after which she returned to her native Israel and joined the faculty at Tel Aviv University, where she heads the program in American Studies. She is the author of Roots of War, The World of Movement in the Confederate South, which came out in 2012 with Harvard University Press and was a co-winner of the Francis B. Simpkins Award from the Southern Historical Association and a finalist for the Lincoln Prize. She has been a fellow at the Shelby Cullom Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton University and at the Berlin Institute for Advanced Studies. Beyond academia, Sternhell is a regular contributor to Haaretz daily newspaper on American affairs and serves on the board of the New Israel Fund, the country's leading human rights and social justice organization. So that summarizes a little bit about Dr. Sternhell, but I want everybody also to know that the book that she'll be discussing with us today, her latest work, has been listed as a finalist for the Lincoln Prize, which means you've now been a finalist for the Lincoln Prize twice, which I mean, I got to be honest, if one of mine was in my entire lifetime, I'd be happy if one of my books was. So, way to go.
Well, we're a little skeptical of these things, aren't we? Right?
I
But
think it's
thank you.
you're
That's very kind, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
So please, if just so everybody knows, we asked Yael to basically kind of split this up, kind of present about the book for about the first 30 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A for the second 30 minutes. So kind of while she's speaking, by all means, please kind of formulate some questions, and let's go ahead and kick this off.
Okay, wonderful. All right, how's that PowerPoint looking?
Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, once again, thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm, such a huge fan of Susanna's and Anne's work. So really honored to be invited to speak here. And thank you all for joining me during what I guess is most people's lunch hour, which is also quite a sacrifice, I feel, to be on a scholarly event at that particular point of the day. So let's get started. Historians often define their craft as rooted in the archive. What makes us historians, what distinguishes us from other scholars in the humanities on the one hand and from journalists on the other, is our ability to work in repositories where the raw material of history is stored. Whether these are the archives of a major nation state, a municipality, a church, a family, a single person, etc. Historians are famously or infamously attached to the archives they work in and to the practices of archival work. Just ask a historian about their experiences in the archive where they had spent last summer, and they will happily launch into a long and boring story about an obscure document they had found, even though it was located in the wrong box and written in illegible script. The archive as a reality, but also as an idea, is intrinsic to who we are and to what we do. And herein, of course, lies the crux of the problem. In fact, every step in the life cycle of an archival record, from its arrival in an archive through its collation, cataloging, description, and presentation to a researcher, is deeply shaped by the politics, policies, and personalities in the archive. Archives are institutions, and like all institutions, they are made by the people who establish, manage, and operate them. They are complex, shifting organisms whose inner workings determine how the records they hold would be used by scholars, and therefore what kind of stories scholars would be able to tell about the past. Archivists, whom historians rarely pay much attention to, maybe save for thanking them in their book acknowledgments, are actually historical actors in their own right. Scholars of many other historical contexts have known this for a while and have done remarkable work deconstructing archival institutions and revealing all the ways in which archives shape historical narratives. In the field of US history, that turn towards a critical inquiry of archives is only in its infancy. Most of the discussion in the field has centered on the question of whether the history of New World slavery can even be written from archives consisting of records created by enslavers and reflecting their humanizing gaze. In these conversations, the archive serves as a kind of catch-all phrase for the dilemmas of historical knowability. The book I have written takes a different approach to archival history. Instead of the indefinite, the archive, I write about an archive, the Federal Repository of Civil War Papers in Washington, and about the men who managed the records created by both armies from their initial ingathering all the way to their publication in an edited collection that has become the basis for what we know or think we know about the most significant event in the history of the United States. The Civil War created an enormous wealth of written records. In many ways, it was the first bureaucratized war. Both armies, numbering a total of 3 million men and spread across an entire continent, generated gargantuan quantities of paperwork which were produced, managed, and preserved by countless adjutants and clerks, the war's unsung heroes. Though it is impossible to reliably quantify this vast body of records, anecdotal evidence offers a glimpse into its scale. By 1860, the federal government had accumulated only 200,000 cubic feet of archival records. By the mid-1870s, that number had ballooned into 1 million cubic feet. This body of records was never coherent, centralized, or properly organized. On both sides of the conflict, some officers and headquarters followed record-keeping protocols religiously, while others ignored them completely. Records were stored, usually pell-mell, in tents, headquarters, and bureaus across the United and Confederate States, and were subject to every vicissitude of war, routinely getting lost or destroyed. At the end of the war, the federal government instructed officers of every rank to ship their papers to the Adjutant General's office in Washington. Though many ignored the order, the records did arrive and were of such an extent that they amounted to a collection which took up entire buildings in the nation's capital. Why didn't the Union Army simply deposit wartime records in the National Archive? Well, for the simple reason that it did not exist. While most other countries in the West had already established central repositories for the collection of government records at that point, the federal government never came close to establishing one. Records were strewn all over Washington, often in no particular order, in basements, attics, hallways, sheds, you name it, and were in constant danger of being lost to fire, floods, rodents, or thieves. At the end of the Civil War, the U.S. Army also engaged in a large-scale effort to gather Confederate records, which were in complete disarray. Many were lost during the final weeks of the war when armies were retreating. Others were burnt during the Great Fire engulfing Richmond in the last 2 days of the war. Now, the initial motivation to gather Confederate records derived from the assumption that they would eventually serve the federal government in post-war trials of the rebellion's leaders that at that point most people had assumed would eventually take place, which of course did not happen. But the records remained and were deposited in a new unit in the War Department called the Archive Office. But as you can see on this stamp on one of their thousands of documents, was colloquially known as the Rebel Archives Bureau. So weirdly, though the United States did not have a central repository for its government records, it had effectively built one for its enemy in the war. Now, all these records, federal and Confederate alike, were largely out of reach for historians interested in researching the Civil War and for their prospective audiences. This was, by all accounts, a huge constituency. The post-Civil War era witnessed what one scholar has called a publication boom related to the war: regimental histories, statistical analyses, personal narratives. Among Civil War veterans in particular, there was huge demand for work that would help them make sense of the experiences they had been through. Historians have debated this obsession of veterans with the finer details of wartime history. Some think it reflected deep psychological needs of men trying to process traumatic experiences. Others think it expressed a callous disregard for the great moral questions underlying the war. Regardless, the desire by Americans for access to the military records generated by the war ran deep. Yet, what veterans and others were clamoring for was not necessarily an open, user-friendly archive where researchers could peruse original records. It was rather that the government edit the records stored in its rooms and make them available in published form. This expectation was rooted in the long-standing tradition by Congress to publish edited collections of primary sources relating to the nation's major historical milestones. It would also potentially allow those who could not travel to Washington to do research, meaning essentially, right, almost everyone, to access original records documenting those events in which they took part. In response to this popular demand, Congress in May 1874 allocated $15,000 to begin the publication of the official records of the War of the Rebellion, both of the Union and of the Confederate armies. Considering the job at hand, this was a minuscule sum of money, but it was enough to set the process in motion. As might be expected from a still Republican-dominated Congress less than a decade after the Civil War, the project's official title was fixed as War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. Now, clearly, archiving original records and editing them for publication were hardly the same thing. One might even argue that from an archival point of view, they are the opposite. And yet the official records, or the OR, has become, without question, the most important historical source for writing the history of the Civil War, and has been used by virtually any scholar in the field. Now, this applies not just to military historians, but to scholars studying the momentous event from any number of angles. It's impossible, for example, to imagine the history of the emancipation without the official records. This is, without question, one of the most important bodies of records ever assembled in America. So what is the OR? For those of you who have not had the chance to work with the source, a few words of explanation are in order. It consists of 128 volumes, numbering roughly 1,000 pages each, and divided into 4 series. The documents filling these pages are printed copies of the official records produced by both armies, reports by officers, correspondence, orders, telegrams, you name it. U.S. records appear first, followed by Confederate records. There is no commentary, except for the occasional footnote. Events follow one another in quick succession, taking the reader from one setting to the next and introducing them to the voices of hundreds upon hundreds of Civil War commanders. The result, as practically anyone who has ever worked with a source can testify, is an incredibly immersive source, which often gives the reader the experience of being transported back in time. And yet again, in some ways, that is exactly the problem. The OR can easily be mistaken for an exhaustive compilation of the government's Civil War records. In hard copy, its sheer bulk is pleasingly daunting. Online, the wealth of results generated by almost any key search amplifies the allure, seemingly obviating additional research in manuscripts stored in the National Archive. The subtitle, The Official Records, right, hints that these are in fact all the official records of the US and Confederate armies. And yet making the OR entailed an enormously labor-intensive process that took place over a quarter century, cost millions of dollars, and was determined by the personalities of the bureaucrats controlling the process, the agendas of the politicians funding it, and the anxieties of the veterans contributing to it. Even more elusively, the making of the OR was grounded in contemporary understandings of history and historical practice. Make no mistake, when we use the OR today, we are still bound by ideas of 19th century military bureaucrats about which historical events mattered and which did not, whose account of the war was worth making public and whose could stay in the dark. So this is just an example of what one page looks like. This is the cover or the title page, and then it just kind of, it gets you going, right? It sends you straight into the action. Just a couple of other images for those who are not OR addicts. And this is the most important figure in the making of the OR. He's a virtually unknown officer by the name of Robert N. Scott, who was born in Tennessee, moved to California as a teenager, and joined the regular army in 1857. During the war, he served as acting assistant adjutant general and then became senior aide-de-camp to no less than General Henry H. Halleck, the U.S. Army's master bureaucrat. After the war, he filled a number of administrative duties and wrote hefty legal treaties until appointed as compiler of the OR in December 1877. Scott took charge of the project under the authority of a newly organized administrative unit called the War Records Office. Though Scott would not see the process of compilation through, he died suddenly 10 years later. During his tenure as head of the War Records Office, he laid down the infrastructure that allowed the work to continue even after his early passing. So unsurprisingly, the first question Scott tackled was selection. Within weeks of his appointment, Scott decided to leave out several classes of documents. These were applications for appointments, contracts, charges of disloyalty, claims, tender of troops, and this is, I think our greatest regret, unsolicited advice. Critically, he also suggested excluding ordinary routine business of the Bureau and departments, which of course opens the question of, what is routine in the mind of an 1870s military bureaucrat in Washington. Now, Scott reflected on his work only rarely, but his 1879 annual report to the Secretary of War offered a glimpse into the demands placed upon the staff as it took on the task of sorting through the records. The amount of labor involved in examining the massive records stored in the city and making judicious selections from them and in the verifications of the copies made can hardly be appreciated by those not immediately connected with the War Department. Scott never said more in writing about what the work of making judicious selections actually meant, or about how he and his aides determined which records deserved to see the light of day in a published compilation and which would remain in the War Department's messy storage spaces. One way to gain some insight into the selection process is to examine the raw records and observe which documents were chosen for publication. Luckily, the War Records Office imprinted each document selected for copying with a stamp reading War Records 1861 to 1865 copied. Two different stamps were used, but neither the stamp nor any other notation on the original records says when a document was reproduced or by which staff member. Since the compilation proceeded chronologically, and since compilers were credited in individual volumes, we know who was in charge of putting each volume together and sending it to the printer. But that's it. We don't know which staff member had actually gone through the originals and determined which records would be copied. Finally, to complicate things further, many of the records marked as copied do not actually appear in the published compilation. Someone, somewhere along the way, decided that they did not meet the criteria for publication, but again, we don't know who, when, or why. So with these caveats in mind, let's look at the raw records. So the sample I chose is 200 pages from the letter sent book of the Adjutant General of the U.S. Army in the months January to May 1862. The handwritten pages in the letter book contain roughly 800 orders, dispatches, telegrams, most of which are run-of-the-mill exchanges about the daily life of the Army. But routine as they are, they provide a genuine reflection of war making. The Adjutant General's office was the central nervous system of the Army. Its letter books, therefore, embody the complex and sprawling nature of the Civil War, as well as probably any written record can. And even in this small fragment, 200 pages out of I don't know how many thousands, the Adjutant General is on record addressing a wide variety of subjects involving a diverse array of actors, humans and animals, generals and privates, soldiers and civilians, men and women, black and white. Letters were addressed to posts, headquarters, and bureaus, spread from coast to coast, and ranged from hurried one-line dispatches to longer, carefully phrased missives. So what did the War Department staff copy? Among the records that ended up in print are some rather obvious choices, like the dispatches announcing the forward movement of the Army of the Potomac on March 10, 1862, which signaled the beginning of the Peninsular Campaign. So right now we can see the stamp here, and indeed this record does appear in the published compilation. It's hardly surprising that Scott and his team gave preference to moments of high drama, to military action per se, and to officers of high rank who made decisions and shaped events in the field. These were the records considered historically valuable by the bureaucrats and by the OR's intended users. It's probably more interesting, in fact, to see what the War Department did not copy into the compilation. One class of uncopied records are those that deal with the interactions between the military establishment and civilians. Now, Scott actually understood that there was more to war than armies, and designated room in the third and fourth series of the OR for records generated by state governments and federal bureaucracies connected to the armies. But this small sample of the letter book includes intriguing and rich documents about the complicated relationship between the Army and a large variety of individuals. Compilers, being laser focused on the battlefield, did not consider these historically valuable and did not include them in the edited compilation. I'll offer just one example, a message dated April 22nd, 1862, and addressed to Major General Nathaniel Banks, commanding the Department of the Shenandoah. And this is what this letter says. Major Henry S. Turner has just returned here from the neighborhood of the Plains, Fauquier County, Virginia, and reports an excitement there on account of outrageous rapes committed there by a party from Geary's camp, which is Colonel John W. Geary, as it is said consisting of 2 soldiers and a Negro upon 2 highly respectable white women named Garrett, a widow, and her young daughter. The document ends with an order by the Secretary of War to conduct an inquiry and bring the culprits to justice. Sexual abuse in the Civil War is, as every scholar of the field knows, is notoriously underdocumented. And even when its traces do appear in writing, the explicit word rape is very rarely used. The fact that this document was deemed unpublishable just exemplifies how different the notions of historically valuable were held by the men who made the collection and us, the collection's later users, the one who are trying to make Civil War history out of the OR today. All right, so onerous as it was, the selection process was only one part of the impossibly large project the War Department had taken on when it committed to publishing the official records of both armies. The bureaucrats making the compilation were extraordinarily committed to the idea of completeness. They hoped that every military event appearing in the records would be represented by every record documenting it, and expended enormous energy in chasing down what they called the missing links in chains of orders or correspondence. This was a difficult task since, despite the seemingly insurmountable mounds of paper stored in Washington, the government's Civil War archive was actually missing innumerable important documents. These remained in the hands of Civil War veterans, either the authors or recipients of letters and orders, who had defied War Department instructions at the end of the war and had taken their letters home. Assembling these missing links would continue for the rest of the century and would require weaving a vast web of communication with hundreds of officers and their families in every corner of the United States and beyond. The reality between the formal sounding official records was actually a crowdsourced project which relied on numerous individuals who either authored the records, were represented in their context, or inherited them through close ties with their original owners. All were therefore, to some degree, interested parties who lent their support to a process in which they had a personal stake. Inevitably, this was bound to make a difference. When Robert N. Scott first took the reins in the War Records Office, he also had to decide what constituted a publishable record, right? So it wasn't just what will stay out, it's also about, right, what will go in. So there were several criteria, and I'm going to address just a couple here. The records had to be contemporaneous, meaning created during the war. Even that is more complicated and tricky than it sounds, but I'm not going to go into that, what is during the war. And then they had to be official, which means, in Scott's own words, all communications designed to influence official action or having that effect as official documents. Both during the Scott era and in its aftermath, War Department officials made a considerable effort to adhere to these rules. They routinely staved off pressure by veterans to publish post-war recollections and personal records, which participants wanted to see in print, of course, to, enhance their reputation. They stood firm on many occasions when veterans, embarrassed by the tone or substance of records they had composed in the heat of the war, demanded to insert corrections. But despite their vigilance and overall devotion to the principles of compilation, the dependence of the War Department on authors of records meant that certain concessions would have to be made. Perhaps the greatest leverage the War Department gave officers in the compilation process was the permission to determine which records they wanted to make public. The War Department actually did not have any mechanism to force anyone to hand over their records. Therefore, every submission of records by a veteran or an heir was in essence a voluntary act, which left substantial room for decision-making on their part. At times, though, the license to send whatever one wanted was made explicit. Senior commanders, in particular the Civil War celebrity generals, seemed to enjoy this privilege more than others. So Robert N. Scott to John C. Fremont in one of their exchanges, "I will be glad to see any official documents that you may desire to have published in the compilation under my charge. Nothing about please hand in everything you have right now. You should have actually handed it in April 1865, and I will press charges if you don't." No, it's a completely different way of conversing with these men. And when it came to George B. McClellan, Scott's own wartime commander, he wrote him consistently in a tone becoming a subordinate. "If there is any correspondence in your possession, strictly official, or that influenced your official action not already furnished in your report on Army of the Potomac and that you would desire to have placed among the war records, I will gladly receive it. Now, amazingly, leaders of the Confederacy, the same men who were once the War Department's greatest enemies, were also able to stipulate which of their records would see the light of day. The gaps in the archival collections of the Confederacy and the dictate of completeness forced the War Department from very early on to approach Confederate veterans and plead with them to provide their records. Though the relationship at first was fraught and filled with suspicions and hostility, over time it became surprisingly cordial and smooth. Confederate veterans provided missing documents, deciphered telegrams, and proofread records before they went into print. Some basically freelanced for the War Department or volunteered considerable time and energy to help the compilation process. In exchange, they were granted the same consideration reserved to other contributors to the work. And so when Robert N. Scott approached no less than Jefferson Davis to ask for records, he explicitly stated that Davis was not required to submit any paper he did not so choose. In their exchanges, Scott employed, again, a deferential tone that left no doubt as to who was in control of the Confederacy's presidential records. Just one example. In arranging the Confederate correspondence covering operations in Virginia, I find several letters from General Lee answering or referring to communications from yourself that I cannot find. Is it asking too much to request that you furnish me with a list of such of your dispatches, letters, or telegrams to General Lee as you are willing to furnish for the compilation? After Davis's death, the War Department remained in touch with his widow, Verena, who also received permission to decide which records the War Department would refrain from using. When one bureaucrat inquired about the records Verena had marked as not to be copied, he was told, "Leave that matter out of question altogether and deal with the rest of the Davis papers." And so even as the bureaucrats compiling the OR yearned for completeness, they accepted omissions as a regrettable but necessary part of their work. At any given moment, the records that actually ended up in OR volumes reflected the exigencies of the compilation process, the personalities of the individuals, and the nature of the records being considered for inclusion. So a few words just to wrap up. Obviously, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what's in the book, but I hope that even these few examples show what we gain when we stop taking archives for granted, whether they are brick and mortar or published like the OR. The sources archives make available to us as historians and the ways they are organized are always the products of complex processes in which the personal and the political intertwine and which have a palpable impact on how we understand the past. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not trying to convince anyone, including myself, maybe especially myself, to abandon archives. Repositories of papers, however flawed, are still the basis for historical work. But I am trying to advocate for a more critical, skeptical, careful approach, which takes into account the underlying structures that are often so difficult to discern. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And I encourage everybody who's in attendance to read the rest of the book because Yael's right. It really was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the breadth of the topics that she covers in that book and also the depth. I want to start us off. Well, first I want to say, y'all please enter any questions you might have for Yael into the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as we have time. And I can say, after scrolling through the list of attendees, I can see that we have quite a few archivists and historians. So I'm sure we'll have some good questions coming through the chat there. But I wanted to start off and sort of ask a sort of meta question, Yael, because really I'm not sure that, and I think we do have a lot of Civil War folks on this webinar, but can you talk a little bit about the scope of the issue here in terms of just the reliance of the historic reliance of Civil War historians on the OR and really why it's such a big deal that we really have looked to this as the definitive and sometimes even almost a sacred source and therefore relied on this so heavily in our work.
Right. And I'm completely, I have done the same thing. I've used the OR. In fact, I used the OR in my first chapter when I talk about the creation of the records during wartime and how the archive is made during the war, but simultaneously unmade. Then, of course, my go-to source for that chapter, which I wrote when I was actually further, pretty far along in the project, I still used it. I mean, I think it has attained, I don't know if any other field has a single source which enjoys, the same kind of, like you say, a sacred place for practitioners. It has a nickname. How many historical sources have nicknames? And I think we've mistakenly assumed, and I know that not everyone thinks that, and I've had historians over the years in which I've worked on this project say to me, yeah, I know that the OR doesn't have it all. I go to the National Archives, and I think we all go to the National Archives. Our field is heavily archival, and I think, we have a great deal to show for ourselves in terms of the archival work that we all do. But when it comes to specifically the records in the OR, it has been easy and in some ways natural for us to believe that, this is all there is, or that this is all you need. And that, whoever made the selection, made the right selection, or maybe there even wasn't a selection. I mean, when we cite the OR, and I don't think there's any exception to this, we never cite the editors of particular volumes, right? No one knows who edited the OR. I mean, these are completely anonymous people. And so I think in that way, we've become just extremely spoiled, in the sense that for military records, you don't need to go to the National Archives. You go to the National Archives for many other things. But when it comes to the kind of the basic, standard military sources you need to sort of get a sense of what was happening on the ground, the OR will cover you. And that is really untrue.
Susanna, are we seeing any more questions coming in?
We are. All right, yeah. We have one asking, these are two somewhat related questions. First, was there any rhetoric of reconciliation around putting together the OR at the time? And second, how did Lost Causers use or reject the OR during their rewriting of Southern history and the war in particular?
Okay, thank you. Great questions. So the final chapter in this book is about the OR and sectional reconciliation. And, without going too deeply into the kind of the theoretical underpinnings, because I've really tried to, keep the book as theory-free as possible, and what is, essentially is a very heavily theorized field of archival studies. But basically, I think I've been, at least I'm persuaded, that I've been able to show that reconciliation both impacted the making of the OR, meaning that Scott was a Southerner by birth, and the Secretary of War who comes in after the Compromise of 1877 is the one who appoints him, and he's really invested in the OR, and he sort of pushes this project. And I think you can see a lot of like the early, forms of reconciliation manifest themselves in the making of the OR. But I've also argued that the OR is a major push for reconciliation, and that a lot of the decisions being made about the OR, for example, to include Union and Confederate records side by side, no commentary. I mean, if you know nothing about the Civil War, you have no idea who won or what the war was about, right? And I have, I'm fairly certain at this point, from really sort of digging up these conversations over a generation between War Department bureaucrats and ex-Confederate officers and politicians, that the process of, coming together after the Civil War was took place in the archive, took place through these exchanges, through this joint work on a project that everyone was invested in, because ex-Confederates were deeply invested in the project. They wanted their story out there. They wanted their heroism. They wanted what they thought of as their righteousness, right, out there in print and published by the federal government. And the federal government was happy to go along with it. So there's this really interesting process there of kind of two-way feeding between reconciliation as a large cultural trend and the OR as one of, and the offices where the OR was made as pushing that process forward. Now, ex-Confederates were ecstatic about the OR. This is all they had ever wanted, just the federal government to tell their story too, along with its own story, and no judgment, right? So they embraced it from the very first volume and deep into the 20th century.
Thank
Well,
you.
we have another related question here, actually, another lost cause question. Someone writes that Verena Davis was a fierce defender of her husband's reputation and promulgator of lost cause ideology. So how does one factor in probable bias on her part or anyone's in what they chose to send or not to send to Scott?
I mean, I think once again, the way to figure this out is to go through the originals and see what wasn't sent in. This was already post Scott. Scott was dead, but the people who took over in the aftermath of his departure followed the same policies. So I would, I mean, are these personal records that she doesn't want to see published? Are these records where her late husband seems aggressive or vengeful or too pro-slavery for the own good of his reputation? I mean, who knows? But I think all of these possibilities should be considered. Now, I'm not saying that we should start from scratch, right? That every book ever written about the Civil War needs to be rewritten. I mean, I think we know a lot. I think we use a lot of different sources. I really do. I take great pride in being part of a field that has been able to do such extraordinarily rich and diverse work over the last couple of generations. But Verena Davis had her own interests to protect, and anything she sent in should be perceived in that mindset, right? That she cannot be trusted. She did not. We know she didn't send everything. The question is, what did she specify not to be copied, and can you track it down? Can you go wherever her papers are, which I actually don't know? Is it in? Is that Rice? Maybe could be, and look at what, and look at where the War Department left a stamp.
Yeah.
Because it
And
did
I think,
leave stamps. You can see War Department stamps in the collections of the Southern Historical Society.
okay.
So
Okay.
there is a way, at least in the collections that I've seen outside of the collections copied, I've seen the stamp. So I think there is a way to see how Verena Davis was manipulating future historians.
Right. And you're right. I don't know where her papers are. Again,
Yeah.
I would assume Rice with his, but not necessarily.
I mean, are they her papers, his papers? I don't, yeah, I mean, who knows what goes on in
Right,
that collection,
right,
and
right.
whether, we should sort of look into that.
Right, right. So there's another question that asks about, the creation of the OR seems to represent a transition from archiving to documentary editing, right? And documentary editing being, the creation of the papers of Thomas Jefferson, the papers of George Washington, like, the careful selection of the publishing of these documents. And they're asking, can you discuss where the OR fits in the history of the field of documentary editing?
Okay, so documentary editing is a venerable American tradition. There were efforts to edit documents of the Revolutionary War during the Revolutionary War. So basically, starting in the 1770s, both forms of preserving records, uh, placing them in a physical brick and mortar archive and editing them for publication and just generating many copies so they would not disappear. Both of these methods uh, got started in Boston pretty much at the very same time. And in the 19th century, I want to say that documentary editing was a more popular form of preserving records than brick and mortar archives. I mean, there are just insane descriptions by archivists in the 19th century telling us what goes on in, let's say, state archives across the United States. And there's a chapter about this kind of just chaos and losses that are incalculable and we'll never be able losses we can't recover, right? And so I think in some ways documentary editing was probably for the bureaucrats and politicians and veterans and veterans widows and wives, everyone who was involved in this process, the go-to option for how to preserve the historical record of the Civil War. Because there were no good, I mean, I'm not saying that there weren't archives, there were archives, but there were no good examples of, kind of straightforward, systematic, easily accessible archives as there are at this point, in other places, though, when I say other places, I mean Britain, France, Canada, though it's complicated everywhere. Each of these countries has its own, very convoluted history of what goes on in their national archives and how people try to manipulate it. But it was documentary editing, and I think part of it has to do just with space, right? That the geographic extent of the United States means that it will always be easier to print 10,000 copies of something and distribute them through Congress, and which is what Congress does. And Congress has rooms full of volumes that they produce, edited compilations, reports, all sorts of printed material that Congress produces, and congressmen sent it to constituents, and often there's just so much that it gets stuck in Congress and just, at some point just becomes too dusty for anyone to really be happy about it. So it's a real American tradition, and to me just makes a lot of intuitive sense.
Right. Yeah, good. Thanks.
Well, to follow up on that, Yael, I am wondering, you make the point a couple of times in the book that this process of archive building becomes an exercise in sort of like a tool for state authority, I think is the way you phrase it. Can you talk a little bit about what a nation, I mean, other nations were doing this more carefully earlier, but how does this actual collection of documents and facts and the story, right, narrative, come to, how does that sort of speak to, how does the US government sort of use this to speak to what they think America should be, or how this should reflect on the
Right.
American
Yeah.
experience?
No, that's a really good question. The OR starts as something completely different. It basically its real beginnings are during the war, when military bureaucrats are just drowning in paperwork and are incapable of sorting out, what are the important reports that officers should read? Like, where are documents with actual battlefield lessons that we should all know about? I mean, there's just so much paperwork that it's impossible to put together. And then this is Halleck, the master bureaucrat, comes up with this idea. Well, let's edit important documents and print them out and distribute them so officers will have access to the critical records of every year of the war and use them just for good military practice. And at that point, the Confederacy doesn't even factor into it. It's like 1864, the war is in full swing. It's unclear when and how it'll end. And then when they revisit this idea in 1866, it's a totally different mindset. The war's over. It's the purpose is no longer military education, but now it is commemoration. And at that point in 1866, in the congressional discussions about how to publish this compilation, you could really feel this sort of, the victorious post-war U.S. Congress wanting a paper monument for the war. And it really is an expression of American nationalism and of Union success in this huge undertaking that they had just been able to, to pull off. But at some point, the discussion turns, and I follow these discussions. The discussion turns into, well, let's include Confederate records as well. And then the idea is, if we want the kind of compilation that everyone will use, which will be the definitive source for the history of the great Civil War that we had just won, then we need Confederate records in there. And that just kind of becomes part of the conversation. And when finally Congress allocates money after several years of, the Secretary of War asking for funding for the project, and, there's not enough money, he's rejected. Finally, in 1874, money comes in. And at that point, the idea that originated in an 1866 discussion is already sort of baked in to the notion of what this should be. And so it really does start as a monument for Union success. And I think this is where I could really see how the archive shapes reality, how the archive is not just a reflection of reality, but an actual force in society. The fact that they need to publish Confederate records, because that's just part of the legislation, because it's considered to be, that will make it the definitive source, then they have to start finding Confederate records. And this is when they start begging and pleading ex-Confederates and negotiating, and then hiring ex-Confederate generals and then ex-Confederate clerks. And at that point, and I follow this really carefully, how the War Department just shifts. I mean, of course, there is, something in the air, right? I mean, there's, it's reconciliation time. But you can actually trace it very carefully, because they are bureaucrats and because at that point they actually keep pretty good records, that you can actually trace the process of how they sort of slowly just come into the fold of ex-Confederates and sort of almost fall in love with them. And the more extreme an ex-Confederate is, then the more useful they are for the War Records Office, right? So Jubal Early, who's, was once called the ultimate unreconstructed rebel, is an extremely useful collaborator for the War Department, because he has documents, because he knows everything, because he has this network of people that he's constantly in touch with, because he's devoting his life, right, to the legacy of the Confederacy. And he becomes indispensable. And Jefferson Davis, who's writing his own history of the Confederacy, is also indispensable, because he's also checking out facts, right? He's also deciphering telegrams. He's also, they're always looking for keys. Where is the key that we need for this telegram? We can't, print it this way. And so it's a really interesting process of how working to fill the gaps in the archive creates this dynamic, which, you know, in the end has national and cultural implications of various kinds.
It's fascinating. I think we have time for one last quick question. Your coda refers to Dallas Irving.
Yes.
Um, and that was actually part of my favorite part of the book, just because anybody who
Thank
ever tried to
you.
use that blasted index of the OR, you
I
know,
appreciate you reading the epilogue. It's also one of my favorite parts, and I'm like, well, no one's gonna, you know, no one reads the epilogue, so that's just, you know, so
those are always fun. But could you talk a little bit about him and that index that he created? Or
so he's a really fascinating character. He's a history PhD. He's a military historian who is one of the first professional employees of the National Archive. So when does the federal government finally get its act together to build the National Archive? It opens in 1934. It's actually not a New Deal project, which is, you know, a common mistake. It gets its start early on in, you know, the first decades of the 20th century. Just the American Historical Association lobbies like crazy, and you know, at some point it just becomes essential. And so the process gets underway, and it just takes, you know, a long time to build this massive, gorgeous building that we all love so much, right? Um, and he's one of the first professional employees, and he sets his eyes on Civil War records from the outset, and actually publishes two or three really important sort of foundational articles about the Confederate records and the OR in the 30s and 40s, which I also just, I find it fascinating that someone during the World War II era is writing about Civil War records, right? And how sort of these, you know, two historical eras kind of come together. Um, and then he's, you know, I think he has a love-hate relationship with the OR and with OR compilers, who are his predecessors, right? There are national archivists before National Archive. And, you know, it's obviously the OR is this massive project, this, you know, hugely useful source, but indexing in the OR was specifically done with veterans in mind. So the OR index is crazy. It's just names, right? Because the idea was that every veteran in any, you know, old folks' home anywhere in the States could take up a volume and find where they appear. But there are, you know, there's nothing of what we need as historians for an index, and Irvine, being a trained historian, knew that. And so he spends 15 years in the 60s and 70s creating a guide index that would help. So you sort of, you take the index, you take the OR index, then take Irvine's index, put them together, and then you get, you know, the name of a battlefield, right? A theater of war, the things that historians actually need when they're researching wars. And in some ways, of course, it's a massive undertaking on top of a massive undertaking, but it becomes completely useless once the internet comes in, right? And you can keyword search. And I've actually, and I think this is why I'm so affectionate about the epilogue, is because I did some oral histories with the people who worked with Irvine. Yeah, were really helpful and just really wonderfully supportive of the project. You know, they described the process of doing it. And, you know, Irvine was not an easy person, but he felt that this was his obligation, is to make the OR usable. And, you know, for people like us who've used the OR in the age of the internet, you know, that experience is completely foreign, sort of having the OR, but it being useless to us because that's not what we're looking for. But it's really interesting to see the way this tradition of these massive undertakings in the National Archives, right, in the kind of National Administration of Records in the United States, whether it's the 19th century War Department or the 20th century professionalized National Archives, how these archivists are just tackling these sort of mammoth projects, trying to rein in Civil War paperwork and make sense of it. And then, eventually, computers did it for us. But I love the fact that there was in some ways, sort of a second try or a phase B of the OR, by people who are still alive today and, have, great sort of personal anecdotes to tell about this story and about the process. And it really kind of, you get a sense of continuity between the 19th century archive and the 20th century archive.
Right. It just felt like somebody who understood what you were doing better
Yeah.
than probably nobody else can. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it was a really great experience, sort of at, the tail end of this long process of writing this book.
Well, we are at time, but thank you so much. I absolutely loved the book. I know, Ann Marshall and I were just determined to have this event so we could share it with our audience. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
And thank
All
you for
right.
everyone who tuned in and sent in questions. And sorry we didn't get to them all, but we'll hope you'll come again.
Feel free to email me. I'm totally available, and there's nothing I'd rather do than talk about this book.
And buy the book. Buy the book, everyone. It's good.
Yale University Press thanks you.
All right. Fantastic. Well, everyone have a good day. Thank you so much.
All
Bye-bye.
right, everyone. Bye-bye.